One of the strangest and most painful seasons in life is the moment you begin to notice something shifting around you, something you can't fully explain. People who once filled your days with laughter slowly become distant. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly now feel forced, or they stop happening entirely. Messages go unanswered, plans stop being made, and suddenly, the circle that once felt full begins to feel quiet, empty. You start asking questions you never thought you would ask. Did I do something wrong? Did I change too much? Why does it feel like everyone is drifting away from me? For many people, this season feels like rejection. It feels like abandonment. It feels like the painful realization that the people who once stood beside you are now walking in a different direction. And when that happens, the mind begins to create stories. Maybe you weren't enough. Maybe they discovered something about you that made them lose respect. Maybe you simply stopped mattering. These thoughts creep into your heart quietly, but they can grow loud very quickly. Because losing people is one of the deepest emotional pains a human being can experience. Not because of hatred, not because of conflict, but because of silence, because of distance, because of the slow realization that someone who once knew your story is no longer part of your present. You replay memories, moments when you laughed together, moments when you believed these people would always be in your life. You remember the promises, the late-night conversations, the dreams you once shared. And the hardest part of all is realizing that those memories now belong to a chapter that has quietly closed. So you try to fix it. You reach out. You try to reconnect. You try to hold the relationship together the way it once was. But something inside you can feel it. The connection is no longer the same. The energy is different. The closeness has faded. And deep down, a painful question begins to rise inside your soul. Why is this happening? Why would relationships that once felt so important suddenly begin to disappear? Why would people who once supported you become distant? Why would friendships that felt unbreakable slowly fade away? For many people, this moment feels like a sign that something is wrong with them. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the reason people are leaving your life has nothing to do with your worth? What if this painful season is not rejection, but redirection? What if the distance you're experiencing right now is not proof that you are losing people, but proof that something deeper is shifting in your life? Because throughout history and throughout countless spiritual journeys, there is a pattern that many people eventually discover. A pattern that is often invisible while it is happening. But when you look back later, it becomes impossible to ignore. Before a new season begins, certain people quietly exit the stage. Not always with conflict, not always with drama. Sometimes it happens so gently that you barely notice it at first. The calls become less frequent. The meetings become rare. The conversations become shorter. Until one day you wake up and realize the circle you once stood in has changed. And while that realization can feel heartbreaking, confusing, and even lonely, there is something important you need to understand. Sometimes the most painful changes in your relationships are not accidents. Sometimes they are part of a quiet realignment happening beneath the surface of your life. A realignment that is preparing you for something you cannot yet see. Because there are moments when life removes people from your path, not to punish you, but to reposition you, not to isolate you, but to protect your next chapter. And the truth that many people discover too late is this. Not everyone who walked with you in one season is meant to walk with you in the next. Some people were part of your comfort, but not part of your calling. Some people were meant to support you while you were learning, but not while you were becoming. And sometimes, before your life can move forward, the wrong voices must grow quiet. The wrong influences must step away. The wrong connections must slowly dissolve. Not because those people were bad, not because you were wrong, but because the path ahead of you requires a different environment, different energy, different alignment. And when that shift begins to happen, it can feel like loss. It can feel like loneliness. It can feel like you are being left behind. But in reality, you may be standing at the beginning of one of the most important transitions of your life. Because when God begins to prepare someone for a new level of purpose, one of the first things that often changes is the people around them. And that quiet shift is where the real story begins. When people begin to disappear from your life, the first thing you usually feel is not anger. It is confusion. Because relationships rarely end in dramatic ways the way movies portray them. Most of the time, they fade quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. One day you simply realize that something that once felt alive now feels distant. You notice that the conversations that once lasted for hours are now reduced to short replies. The energy between you has changed. The connection that once felt effortless now requires effort. And even when you try to pretend everything is normal, there is a quiet awareness inside your heart that something has shifted, something important, something irreversible. That realization can be deeply painful, not because the person has become your enemy, but because they have become unfamiliar. Someone who once understood you now feels like a stranger. Someone who once stood beside you now seems to be walking a different path, and the mind struggles to make sense of it. You begin searching for explanations. You analyze past conversations. You replay moments in your memory. You wonder if there was a sentence you said that caused the distance, a decision you made that changed their perception of you, a moment where everything quietly started to unravel. The human heart has a natural need for closure. We want to understand why things change. We want to know what caused the distance. We want a clear explanation for why people who once loved us, supported us, or walked beside us no longer feel close. But the difficult truth is that many relationships do not end with clear explanations. Sometimes they simply fade, and that kind of ending can be even harder to process. Because without a clear reason, the mind begins to create its own conclusions. Maybe they outgrew you. Maybe you disappointed them. Maybe you changed too much. Maybe you weren't enough. These thoughts are powerful, and if left unchecked, they can quietly shape the way you see yourself. Because losing people often feels like losing pieces of your identity. Think about it. Many of the people in your life have known you through specific seasons. They saw you when you were younger, when you were learning, when you were struggling, when you were becoming the person you are today. They were witnesses to chapters of your story. So when they leave, it can feel like part of your story is leaving with them. And that feeling can create a strange emotional emptiness. You may still be surrounded by people, but something inside you knows that certain voices are missing. Certain presences are gone. Certain connections that once shaped your everyday life are no longer there. And the silence they leave behind can be heavy. Because relationships are not just about conversation. They are about familiarity. They are about shared history. They are about the quiet understanding that someone knows who you are without you needing to explain it. When that disappears, it can feel like standing in a familiar place that suddenly feels unfamiliar. The same city, the same routines, the same life. But something about the atmosphere has changed. And the truth is, very few people talk openly about this kind of loss. Society tends to acknowledge certain types of grief. When someone passes away, when a marriage ends, when a major life event changes everything. But the quiet grief of losing people who are still alive often goes unspoken. Friendships fade. Connections dissolve. People move on with their lives. And you are left with memories that no longer exist in the present. That kind of loss is subtle, but it is deeply real. Because relationships shape the emotional landscape of our lives. They influence how we see ourselves. They affect how we experience the world. They create environments where we feel understood or misunderstood, supported or alone. So when those environments change, it is natural to feel unsettled. It is natural to feel sadness. It is natural to feel like something important has been taken away from you. But there is something important that many people eventually realize when they look back on seasons like this. Not every relationship that ends is a failure. Not every distance is a betrayal. Not every separation is a loss. Sometimes relationships end because the role they were meant to play in your life has already been fulfilled. Some people are part of your story for a specific chapter. They help shape who you are becoming. They influence the direction of your life. They walk beside you during a particular season. But that does not always mean they are meant to stay forever. The difficult part is that we rarely recognize this while the change is happening. When people begin to drift away, it feels like something is being taken from us. But what if the shift you are experiencing is not simply about people leaving? What if it is about your life moving into a new environment? Because environments are not just physical places. They are emotional ecosystems. They are circles of influence. They are networks of energy, perspective, and belief that surround your daily life. The people around you influence the way you think, the way you see yourself, the way you approach opportunities, the way you respond to challenges. And sometimes, when your life begins to move in a new direction, the environment that once supported your old season no longer fits the person you are becoming. This does not always mean that people were wrong. It simply means the alignment has changed. Imagine trying to wear clothing that once fit you perfectly years ago. There was nothing wrong with those clothes. They served their purpose. They belonged to a certain version of your life. But eventually, growth changes things. The same clothing that once fit comfortably no longer matches who you are today. Relationships can be similar. Some people are perfectly aligned with who you were, but they may not align with who you are becoming. And when that shift begins to happen, distance can quietly appear. Sometimes without conflict. Sometimes without explanation. Sometimes without either person fully understanding why. But deep down, something inside you can sense it. Your life is changing. Your perspective is evolving. Your priorities are shifting. And the circle that once felt permanent is slowly rearranging itself. This is the moment where many people feel the most vulnerable. Because change creates uncertainty. And uncertainty can feel like loss. But what if this moment is not the end of something important? What if it is the beginning of a deeper realignment? What if the people who are leaving your life are not being removed to hurt you, but to prepare the environment for something new? Because throughout life, there is a pattern that many people eventually notice. Before new doors open, certain voices grow quiet. Before new opportunities appear, certain influences step away. Before a person steps into a new level of purpose, the circle around them often begins to change. And while that process can feel lonely in the moment, it may actually be the first sign that your life is moving into a new chapter you have not yet seen. Because sometimes, before the right people can enter your life, the wrong alignment must first make space. If you study the stories of people whose lives eventually changed the course of history, you will begin to notice something unusual. Their greatest moments of purpose rarely began with crowds. They began with separation. Before the influence, before the recognition, before the platform, there was almost always a season where their environment changed and many of the people around them disappeared. At first glance, those seasons looked like loss. They looked like abandonment. They looked like isolation. But when you look deeper, those moments were not accidents. They were preparation. Because throughout history, one pattern appears again and again. Before elevation, there is often separation. Before a person steps into a new level of purpose, their surroundings begin to shift. And that shift almost always includes people. Consider the story of Joseph. Joseph grew up surrounded by family. He had brothers, a father, a household filled with familiarity and connection. But when the moment arrived for his destiny to unfold, everything changed suddenly. Joseph was separated from the environment he had always known. He was taken away from the people who once surrounded him. At the time, it looked like betrayal. It looked like rejection. It looked like the destruction of his life. But years later, it became clear that what looked like loss was actually positioning. Because the environment Joseph needed to fulfill his purpose was not the one he started in. If Joseph had remained in the same circle, the same family dynamic, the same familiar environment, the future waiting for him could never have unfolded. The separation was painful, but it was also necessary. The same pattern appears in the life of Moses. Moses began his life in the palace of Egypt, surrounded by power, influence, and privilege. But when the time came for his calling to develop, he was removed from that environment. He spent years in the wilderness, years away from the people who once surrounded him, years in obscurity, years in quiet preparation. To anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like Moses lost everything. He lost his status. He lost his position. He lost the environment he once belonged to. But those years in the wilderness were not wasted. They were shaping him. They were teaching him. They were preparing him for a leadership role that required humility, resilience, and spiritual depth. The palace could not produce that version of Moses. Only the wilderness could. And that wilderness required separation. Even David experienced this pattern. Before David became king, he was a shepherd. He spent countless hours alone in fields, far away from the noise of society. While other people were surrounded by community, David spent long stretches of time in quiet isolation. But those lonely moments were not meaningless. They were developing something inside him. They were strengthening his courage. They were shaping his character. They were creating the inner strength that would one day allow him to stand against giants. Without those seasons of separation, David would have lacked the depth required for the position he would eventually hold. And then there is Jesus. Even Jesus experienced seasons of profound separation. Before his ministry began, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, alone, removed from society. removed from familiar environments, removed from the people who would eventually follow him. That wilderness was not punishment. It was preparation. It was a space where clarity was formed, where strength was refined, where purpose became unshakable. And this pattern is not limited to ancient history. It continues to appear in the lives of people today. Sometimes when a person is being prepared for a new chapter, the environment around them begins to change. Certain friendships grow distant. Certain conversations fade. Certain connections slowly dissolve. And in those moments, the natural assumption is that something has gone wrong. But what if something is actually going right? What if the environment that once surrounded you is no longer the environment that supports your next season? Because environments shape identity. They influence what you believe is possible. They influence the way you see yourself. They influence the direction of your life. If the people around you only know the version of you that existed in the past, it can be difficult for them to understand the person you are becoming. Not because they are bad people, but because their image of you is connected to an earlier chapter of your story. Growth can sometimes create distance. When your mindset changes, your priorities change. When your priorities change, your habits change. And when your habits change, the relationships built around your old patterns may no longer feel natural. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of personal transformation. Many people expect growth to bring more connection. But sometimes growth actually reduces the number of people who can walk beside you. Not because you are becoming better than others, but because your path is becoming more specific, more focused, more aligned with a direction that not everyone will understand. Imagine trying to explain a dream that only you can see, trying to describe a calling that others have never felt, trying to walk toward a future that does not yet exist in visible form. Not everyone will be able to relate to that journey. Some people may feel uncomfortable with the changes they see in you. Others may simply drift away because their path is moving in a different direction. And while that can feel painful in the moment, it does not mean the connection was meaningless. Every relationship has its season. Some relationships are meant to support you while you are learning. Some are meant to support you while you are healing. Some are meant to support you while you are discovering who you are. But not every relationship is meant to continue into the season where you fully step into your purpose. Sometimes the environment must change before the next level of your life can begin. Because the voices around you shape the atmosphere of your life. They influence your courage. They influence your confidence. They influence the way you interpret opportunities and challenges. If the environment around you constantly pulls you back toward the past, it becomes difficult to move toward the future. So sometimes the shift begins quietly, not with dramatic arguments, not with sudden endings, but with distance. Conversations become less frequent. Plans stop aligning. Life moves in slightly different directions. And eventually, the circle changes. In the moment, that change can feel like loss. But if you look closely at the stories of people who eventually stepped into extraordinary purpose, you will often see the same sequence. First came separation. Then came preparation. And only after those two seasons did elevation appear. Because the truth is, new levels require new environments. And sometimes the only way for a new environment to appear is for the old one to slowly release its hold. This is one of the hardest transitions in life to understand while it is happening. But many people later look back and realize something profound. The relationships that faded away were not random losses. They were quiet realignments. Moments where life was gently rearranging the environment around them so that the next chapter could unfold. And when that realization finally arrives, the pain of those earlier separations begins to make sense. Because sometimes the people leaving your life are not signs that you are losing something important. Sometimes they are signs that your life is being prepared for something greater than the environment you started in. Why some people cannot go where God is taking you. One of the most painful truths about spiritual growth is this. Not everyone who begins the journey with you is meant to finish it with you. That realization can feel brutal. Because many of the people who disappear from your life were once very important to you. They laughed with you. They supported you. They knew parts of your story that no one else knew. And yet, suddenly or gradually, something begins to change. Conversations feel different. The connection feels strained. There is tension where there used to be peace. At first, you try to fix it. You try to communicate more. You try to explain yourself. You try to hold the relationship together. But the harder you try, the more distant things become. And eventually you begin to wonder, what happened to us? What many people do not realize is that spiritual growth often creates directional separation. It is not always about right and wrong. Sometimes it is simply about different destinations. Growth changes your alignment. When God begins working deeply in your life, He starts adjusting your priorities. Things that once seemed normal suddenly feel uncomfortable. Conversations that used to entertain you now feel empty. Environments that once felt exciting now feel draining. You are not judging people, but your spiritual alignment is shifting, and alignment determines connection. Imagine two travelers walking together on a road. As long as the road goes the same direction, they walk side by side. But if one road turns east and the other turns west, eventually they must separate. Not because they hate each other, but because they are no longer going the same way. The same thing happens spiritually. God begins pulling your life toward a new direction. And some people simply are not meant to walk that path. The hidden influence of people around you. Many people underestimate how much influence relationships have on their destiny. The people around you shape your thinking, your habits, your expectations, your emotional environment. Scripture repeatedly warns about this principle. Because influence works quietly, you rarely notice it while it is happening. But over time, it shapes your identity. This is why God sometimes removes people before your next season begins. Not because those people are evil, but because their influence would make your calling harder to fulfill. Imagine trying to climb a mountain while someone constantly tells you, "Why are you climbing? That mountain isn't worth it. You're changing too much." Even if they mean well, their words slowly create doubt. Eventually, you start questioning the very path God placed in front of you. So sometimes, God does something merciful but painful. He separates the voices. Not everyone understands your calling. Another difficult truth is that some people simply cannot understand what God is doing in your life. And that is not their fault. They only see the version of you they have always known. They remember the old you, the comfortable you, the predictable you. But when God begins transforming your life, that version of you starts disappearing. Your goals change. Your boundaries change. Your habits change. And suddenly the people around you feel like they are losing the person they once knew. From their perspective, it feels like you are changing too much. But from God's perspective, you are becoming who you were meant to be. And that transformation can create tension, because some people prefer the version of you that fit inside their expectations. The pain of outgrowing relationships. One of the hardest experiences in life is realizing that you have outgrown certain relationships. Not because you became better, but because you became different. You developed new priorities, new values, new direction. And sometimes that new direction no longer fits the relationship dynamic that once existed. This is painful because memories remain. You remember the good moments, the loyalty, the laughter, the shared experiences. So when distance appears, it feels like betrayal. But often it is not betrayal. It is evolution. Life seasons change. And relationships that belong to one season do not always belong to the next. The story of Abraham and Lot. A powerful biblical example of this dynamic appears in the story of Abraham and Lot. At first, they traveled together. They shared land, resources, and protection. Their relationship was strong. But as their lives grew, conflict began appearing between their groups. Eventually, Abraham made a surprising decision. He suggested they separate. Not because they hated each other, but because staying together was creating unnecessary conflict. Separation allowed both of them to pursue their paths. This moment reveals something profound. Sometimes peace only appears after distance. When loyalty becomes limitation. Many people stay in certain relationships far longer than they should. Why? Because they believe loyalty means never letting go. But real loyalty is not about holding on to relationships that damage your spiritual direction. Sometimes loyalty means loving someone enough to release them from a path they were never meant to walk with you. God does not call you to carry everyone into your future. Some people were meant to walk with you for a chapter, not the entire story. And forcing them into a role they were never meant to play can create frustration for both of you. The jealousy that appears during growth. Another uncomfortable reality is that growth can expose hidden jealousy in relationships. At the beginning, when everyone is at the same level, everything feels equal. But when one person begins growing faster than the others, emotions shift. Suddenly your progress becomes uncomfortable for someone else. They may never say it directly, but you start noticing subtle changes. A less support, more criticism, passive comments, silent distance. This happens because your growth forces people to confront their own stagnation, and not everyone is ready for that. So instead of growing with you, they slowly create distance. Again, this is painful, but it is also revealing. It shows who celebrates your growth and who quietly resents it. God protects your next season. When God begins preparing you for something significant, He often protects that future by adjusting your circle. Not everyone can handle the weight of your next season. Some people are comfortable with you being small, because your smallness made them feel secure. But your growth disrupts that comfort. So God sometimes removes people not because they are bad, but because they cannot handle who you are becoming. Think about a seed planted in soil. When the seed begins growing into a tree, the soil that once contained it must eventually give way. Roots expand. Space increases. Growth demands a different environment. The same principle applies to your life. The environment that supported your early development may not support your future expansion. The silence that follows separation. One of the strangest parts of these transitions is the silence that follows. After someone leaves your life, there is often a period where everything feels quiet. The conversations stop. The routine changes. The emotional space feels unfamiliar. At first, that silence can feel lonely. But if you pay attention, you will notice something else inside that silence. Clarity. Without the constant noise of certain voices, you begin hearing your own thoughts more clearly. Your focus improves. Your decisions feel less complicated. And slowly you realize something surprising. The separation did not destroy your peace. It restored it. The courage to let God reshape your circle. The truth is that many people sense when a relationship season is ending, but they resist it. They hold on longer than necessary. They try to revive something that has already completed its purpose. Why? Because letting go feels like failure. But in reality, letting go can be an act of faith. It means trusting that God understands your future better than you do. It means believing that the relationships meant for your next chapter will eventually appear. And they will. Because God never removes something without eventually providing something better aligned with your purpose. A new circle for a new season. One of the most encouraging realities about these transitions is this. When God removes certain people from your life, He often replaces them with others who are aligned with your next level. These new relationships feel different. They support your growth. They challenge your thinking. They celebrate your progress instead of competing with it. And suddenly you realize something powerful. The people who once felt essential to your life were actually temporary companions. They were part of the journey, but not the destination. The deeper meaning behind the separation. If you look back over your life, you will probably notice a pattern. Certain people entered your life during specific seasons. They played a role. They taught lessons. They shaped experiences. Then eventually, they disappeared. At the time it felt confusing. But later, when you looked back, it made sense. Because their presence belonged to a particular chapter. And when that chapter ended, the relationship naturally closed as well. This is not something to resent. It is something to recognize. Life moves through seasons, and relationships often follow those same rhythms. The question you must ask yourself, when someone disappears from your life, the most helpful question is not, why did they leave? The deeper question is, what is God preparing me for next? Because every ending in your life creates space for something new. New opportunities, new growth, new people, new clarity. Sometimes what feels like loss is actually preparation. God is reorganizing your environment so that your future can unfold without unnecessary resistance. And once you understand that, the pain of separation begins transforming into something else. Not bitterness, not regret, but quiet trust. Trust that the same God who guided people into your life also knows exactly when their season with you has ended. And when that moment comes, letting go is not defeat. It is alignment with the next chapter of your destiny. The hidden blessing inside painful endings. At first, when someone disappears from your life, it rarely feels like a blessing. It feels like loss, like confusion, like something important just broke in a way you didn't expect. You replay conversations in your mind. You analyze the last interactions. You ask yourself questions that seem impossible to answer. Did I do something wrong? Could I have fixed this? Why did things change? Painful endings create a strange emotional fog. And inside that fog, it becomes difficult to see what God might actually be doing behind the scenes. But if you study the way God works throughout life, and throughout Scripture, you begin to notice a pattern. God often hides blessings inside painful endings. Not because he enjoys seeing people suffer, but because certain blessings can only appear after something else ends. And until we understand that, we often resist the very changes that are meant to free us. Every ending creates space. One of the simplest but most powerful truths about life is this: nothing new can fully enter your life if everything old is still occupying the space. Think about a garden. If a gardener never removes dead branches, dying plants, or overgrown roots, the garden eventually becomes overcrowded. Healthy plants struggle to grow. Sunlight cannot reach the soil. New seeds cannot take root. So sometimes the gardener must prune. And pruning looks destructive. Branches are cut. Leaves fall. Parts of the plant disappear. But pruning is not destruction. It is preparation. Because once the excess is removed, the plant grows stronger than before. In many ways, God works the same way in our lives. Certain relationships, habits, and environments occupy space that future blessings need. And until that space opens, the next chapter cannot begin. When comfort becomes a cage. Another reason painful endings can contain hidden blessings is because comfort can quietly become a cage. Human beings naturally attach themselves to what is familiar. Even if something is no longer healthy, the fact that it is familiar makes it feel safe. This is why people often stay in relationships, environments, or situations that no longer align with their growth. Not because they are good, but because they are known. Familiar pain sometimes feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. But when God begins moving your life forward, he often disrupts that comfort. Suddenly something changes. The relationship ends. The friendship fades. The environment shifts. And it feels like stability is being taken away. But sometimes what we call stability is actually stagnation. And God refuses to let stagnation define your future. The story of Joseph, rejection that led to destiny. One of the most powerful examples of hidden blessings inside painful endings appears in the life of Joseph. Joseph experienced a series of devastating losses. First, he was rejected by his own brothers. Then he was sold into slavery. Later, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. From a human perspective, Joseph's life looked like a chain of disasters. Every time something seemed to improve, another painful setback followed. But years later, when Joseph looked back at his life, he saw something different. If those people had stayed in your life, your path might have gone somewhere completely different, and not necessarily somewhere better. What once looked like loss now reveals itself as protection. God closed a door not to punish you, but to prevent a future that would have damaged your calling. The gift of emotional strength. Another hidden blessing inside painful endings is resilience. Every difficult separation strengthens your emotional and spiritual endurance. You learn how to process grief, how to release attachment, how to rebuild your life direction. These skills become incredibly valuable later in life. Because the truth is that everyone faces unexpected endings. Relationships change. Opportunities shift. Life moves through unpredictable seasons. The people who learn how to navigate these transitions with faith and maturity become far stronger than those who avoid change. They develop a quiet confidence. They understand that endings are not always disasters. Sometimes they are simply transitions into something greater. The blessing that appears later. Many of the greatest blessings in life only make sense in hindsight. At the moment something ends, the future looks uncertain. But months or years later, you begin seeing connections that were invisible before. A new friendship appears. A new opportunity opens. A new direction emerges. And suddenly you realize something profound. If the old relationship had remained, you might never have stepped into this new chapter. The ending created space. Space for growth. Space for alignment. Space for the life God was preparing for you. And that is when the painful ending begins transforming into something else entirely. Not just a memory, but a turning point. A moment that quietly redirected your life towards something better than you could have imagined at the time. How to recognize when God is removing someone from your life. One of the most confusing experiences in life is trying to understand whether a relationship is meant to be repaired or released. Because not every conflict means separation, and not every distance means the relationship is over. Sometimes people simply go through difficult seasons. Misunderstandings happen. Communication breaks down. Emotions get tangled. And with patience, humility, and grace, relationships can heal and grow stronger. But there are other times when something deeper is happening. Times when the connection begins to fade in ways that no amount of effort seems able to fix. And that is often when people start asking the question, is God removing this person from my life? This question is not about blaming God for every breakup or disagreement. Life is more complex than that. But there are patterns, subtle signs, that sometimes appear when a relationship has reached the end of its purpose in your journey. Recognizing those patterns requires honesty, reflection, and spiritual awareness. The first sign, forced connections. One of the earliest indicators that a relationship may be ending is when the connection begins to feel forced. At one time, conversations flowed naturally. You understood each other easily. Spending time together felt energizing rather than draining. But slowly something changes. Conversations feel awkward. Silence becomes heavy. Interactions require effort that once felt effortless. It can feel like two people trying to hold together something that is naturally drifting apart. Many people interpret this shift as a failure. They try harder. They push conversations. They attempt to recreate the closeness that once existed. But sometimes the change is not a failure. It is simply the signal that the season is ending. Not every relationship is meant to last forever in the same form. And when God begins redirecting your life, certain connections naturally lose their alignment. The bond that once made sense no longer fits the direction your life is moving. The second sign, constant conflict without growth. Conflict in relationships is normal. Disagreements are part of human connection. Healthy relationships can survive arguments because both people are willing to grow, apologize, and understand each other. But when a relationship begins to experience constant conflict without any growth, something deeper may be happening. The same arguments repeat. The same misunderstandings return. Apologies may happen, but nothing truly changes. Over time, the relationship becomes emotionally exhausting. Instead of bringing peace or encouragement, it becomes a source of tension. In moments like this, people often try to fix the relationship through more communication or compromise. And sometimes that works. But other times the conflict continues because the relationship has already reached its natural conclusion. Not every bond is designed to evolve forever. Some are meant to teach a lesson and then release you into the next stage of your life. The third sign, your values begin to diverge. Another powerful indicator appears when the core values of two people begin moving in different directions. In the beginning, those differences may not seem significant, but as time passes, they become harder to ignore. One person may be pursuing growth, discipline, and purpose. The other may be comfortable staying exactly where they are. One person may be moving toward deeper faith and spiritual awareness. The other may be uninterested in that direction. These differences create tension because shared values are the foundation of long-term relationships. Without them, even the strongest emotional connection eventually struggles to survive. This does not mean one person is better than the other. It simply means their paths are no longer aligned. And when God begins shaping your purpose, alignment becomes more important than comfort. The fourth sign, peace begins to replace attachment. One of the most surprising signs that a relationship may be ending is the gradual replacement of attachment with peace. At first, the thought of losing that person feels terrifying. You cannot imagine your life without them. But as time passes, something subtle begins to shift. The emotional grip loosens. The urgency fades. And instead of anxiety, you begin feeling a quiet calm. You start realizing that your life will continue even if the relationship ends. This does not mean you stop caring about the person. It simply means the emotional dependence is dissolving. And when that happens, many people feel a strange mixture of sadness and peace at the same time. That peaceful clarity is often the moment when people recognize that God may be gently guiding them toward a new chapter. The fifth sign, doors naturally close. Sometimes the clearest sign appears through circumstances rather than emotions. Opportunities change. People move away. Schedules become incompatible. Communication becomes less frequent. At first, these changes feel temporary, but gradually they become permanent. The relationship slowly fades without any dramatic event. No major conflict. No sudden betrayal. Just distance. Life moves forward in different directions. These moments can feel confusing because there is no clear reason for the ending. But sometimes the absence of conflict is exactly the point. The relationship simply completed its role in your life. And instead of forcing closure through confrontation, God allows the connection to quietly dissolve. The sixth sign: you begin growing in ways that require change. One of the strongest signals that a relationship may be ending appears when your personal growth begins requiring a different environment. Growth changes people. When your mindset evolves, your habits shift, and your purpose becomes clearer, your relationships naturally adjust. Some people grow alongside you. Others remain connected, but in a different capacity. And some relationships slowly fade because the direction of your life no longer fits the structure of the connection. This transition is not always comfortable, because growth often requires leaving behind what once felt familiar. But if you resist that change, you risk holding on to relationships that belong to a past version of yourself. And doing so can quietly limit the person you are becoming. The seventh sign: God begins redirecting your focus. Another subtle signal occurs when your focus begins shifting toward new responsibilities, opportunities, or callings. You may feel drawn toward a new mission, a new path, a deeper spiritual direction. And as your focus sharpens, some relationships begin receiving less attention. Not because you are intentionally neglecting them, but because your life energy is being redirected. Many people feel guilty during this stage. They believe they must maintain every relationship exactly as it once was. But life does not work that way. As purpose becomes clearer, priorities change, and relationships naturally reorganize around those priorities. This is part of the process of stepping into the life you are meant to live. Releasing without bitterness. Recognizing that a relationship may be ending is only part of the process. The deeper challenge is learning how to release it without bitterness. Because resentment has a way of trapping people in the past. Even after the relationship ends, the emotional energy remains stuck. But when you release someone with forgiveness and gratitude for the role they played in your life, something powerful happens. You free yourself. You allow your heart to remain open instead of becoming hardened by disappointment. And most importantly, you create emotional space for the new relationships that may be waiting ahead. Trusting the larger story. Life rarely reveals its full meaning in the moment events occur. Often it takes years before we understand why certain people entered our lives and why others left. But when you step back and look at the larger story of your life, patterns begin to appear. Certain relationships shaped your character. Others redirected your path. Some protected you from making destructive decisions, and others prepared you for opportunities that came later. What once looked like chaos begins to reveal a deeper design, and that realization brings peace. Because you understand that every relationship, whether temporary or lifelong, played a role in shaping the person you are becoming. The quiet confidence that comes with trust. When you begin trusting that God is guiding your relationships, a quiet confidence replaces anxiety. You stop trying to force every connection to last forever. You stop blaming yourself for every ending. Instead, you begin approaching relationships with gratitude for the season they exist. If they stay, you cherish them. If they leave, you release them. Because you trust that your life is moving forward according to a larger plan. And the people who truly belong in your future will naturally remain part of that journey. When people leave, God is still writing your story. There is a moment in many people's lives when they suddenly realize something painful. The circle they once had is no longer the same. The people they used to talk to every day are now distant memories. Conversations that once felt natural now feel unfamiliar. And the relationships that once seemed permanent have quietly faded into the past. When this happens, the first reaction is usually confusion. People begin replaying memories in their mind. They wonder what went wrong. They question whether they could have done something differently. They search for answers inside moments that can no longer be changed. But what if the story is not about something going wrong? What if the story is actually about something moving forward? Because one of the hardest truths in life is that not every relationship is meant to walk with you through every chapter of your journey. Some people are part of the beginning, some are part of the middle, and only a few remain until the end. This is not a sign that your life is broken. It is simply the nature of growth. As your life unfolds, the direction of your path begins to change. Your mindset evolves. Your priorities shift. Your purpose becomes clearer. And as those internal changes happen, your external environment begins adjusting as well. Sometimes that adjustment includes the people around you. Not because they are bad, not because you are better, but because the road ahead requires a different alignment. There are relationships designed for the season when you were discovering who you were. There are relationships designed for the season when you were healing from past wounds. There are relationships designed for the season when you were learning important lessons about trust, loyalty, and character. And then there are relationships meant for the season when you fully step into the person you are becoming. Each of those stages can involve different people, and that can be painful to accept. Because human hearts crave permanence. We want the people we love to stay forever. We want the friendships that shaped us to last without change. But life rarely moves in straight lines. It moves in seasons. Just like nature moves from spring to summer, summer to autumn, and autumn to winter. Relationships also move through seasons. Some bloom beautifully. Some fade quietly. Some transform into something different. And some end entirely. But none of them are meaningless. Every connection leaves an imprint on your story. Every conversation, every shared moment, every challenge, every memory contributes to the person you eventually become. Even the painful endings. Especially the painful endings. Because those moments often reveal the deepest truths about who you are. They teach resilience. They teach forgiveness. They teach emotional strength. They teach you how to stand on your own when the people you once relied on are no longer beside you. And in those moments of solitude, something surprising often happens. You begin discovering a deeper relationship with God. Because when human support becomes uncertain, spiritual awareness grows stronger. When external voices fade, the quiet voice inside becomes clearer. And sometimes that quiet voice gently reminds you of something important. Your story was never meant to depend entirely on other people. People can support your journey. They can walk beside you. They can love you. But the direction of your life ultimately comes from something greater. From a purpose that existed long before certain relationships entered your life. And that purpose continues moving forward even after some people leave. The truth is, the right people for your future will not need to be forced into your life. They will naturally align with the person you are becoming. They will understand your direction. They will respect your growth. They will support the calling that is unfolding in your life. And when those relationships appear, they will not feel like constant struggle. They will feel like alignment. But until that moment arrives, there may be seasons where your circle becomes smaller, quieter, more focused. And while that can feel lonely at times, it can also be one of the most powerful seasons of personal transformation. Because in those quieter moments, you begin building a deeper foundation within yourself. You learn to stand without relying on constant approval. You learn to trust your inner convictions. You learn to walk forward even when the path feels uncertain. And those lessons create a strength that no external relationship can provide. So if you are in a season where certain people have quietly disappeared from your life, if conversations have faded, if friendships have drifted, if relationships that once felt permanent have changed in ways you never expected, do not assume your life is falling apart. Sometimes what looks like loss is actually alignment. Sometimes what feels like rejection is actually redirection. And sometimes the people leaving your life are making space for the ones who are meant to walk beside you in the chapters that have not yet been written. Your story is still unfolding. Your purpose is still developing. And the relationships that truly belong in your future will appear exactly when the time is right. So instead of holding tightly to what has already passed, take a deep breath. Release the past with gratitude. And step forward with trust. Because even when people leave your life, God is still writing the next chapter of your story.